the whole thing around this 6:30 a.m. is hugely important. So I don't know if I've ever explained this, but I can only talk from what I know from being on the regional crime squad at that time at Essex and working with the drug squad on a regular basis back then. I know all of these people. I know most of the detectives on the drug squad, and who then subsequently then went on to the murder squad. Some of them were very good friends of mine. And so this is all very difficult. The reality is that from what we know, Tate, Tucker and Rolfe were under surveillance. Now, in order to carry out surveillance on them, there's two types of surveillance. There's conventional surveillance, where you literally follow someone and you observe them. And then there's technical surveillance. Now, technical surveillance back in those days was a lump almost the size of a brick with aerials hanging off of it. And the only people who had access to that type of technology back then, we're talking 95, were literally the regional crime squads, the flying squad, other specialist squads, and the drug squad. Essex Drug Squad did have access to tracking equipment through the Technical Support Unit, TSU. We have spoken to a number of the Essex detectives on the drug squad who had previously tried to follow Tate, and we've been told you couldn't follow him conventionally. You couldn't follow him. It was too difficult. It wasn't possible. So they would have immediately gone for a technical surveillance capability, which would mean putting, as I described, that lump, that tracker onto the Range Rover. Now, you don't run. We know, there is evidence that they ran observation posts, OPs, on Craig Rolfe's address. That's in evidence. But they say that they then stood the surveillance down. I can't remember which day it was, Al, but they stood it down a couple of days before the murders. Personally, I think there was a tracker on that car. I think that's why Essex Drug Squad officers knew at 6:30 a.m. and called Dave Bright at 6:30 a.m. I think that, what would have happened at the time was they would have come on, they wouldn't have found the Range Rover at the home addresses. They would have then gone what we used to call go high, where you get a signal, a vector. You then go out to the vector and you basically do a street search until you find the car. They would have found the car in Workhouse Lane. They'd have found 3 dead men in it, at which point you can imagine the panic that would have set in. You got 3 of your targets under surveillance, shot dead in a Range Rover. That's, I think, what happened. That's my view. There was no evidence of that, other than the call from, obviously, the detective on the drug squad today, Bright, and Barrington's evidence. But that's what I think. That's what I think happened. The other thing around it is there is a check on the PNC, on the Police National Computer, on the morning, Albert, isn't there? I can't remember what time it is, but there's a check by an officer from Essex Police on the Range Rover on that morning. And that's never been explained. And the check is shown as being done at Craig Rolfe's address. That's correct, Albert, isn't it? Yeah.
Correct, 6:30 outside his home address.
So, I mean, that's completely unexplained. No one's explained that. An Essex detective does a PNC check on the Range Rover and shows it outside of Craig Rolfe's address at that time of the morning. And that officer is on the drug squad. So it makes you wonder whether or not they haven't found the car on the drive. They've done a PNC check to see if it's been, involved in anything. And then obviously the tracker car's gone out and found the car with the lump on it.
To add to that, there is a witness who puts a white Ford Sierra Cosworth at the top of the lane, no one in it, at not 8 o'clock, it's much earlier, 6:30, 7 o'clock. I think it's 7 o'clock is actually the time of it. I can look at that. So there's a sighting of a white vehicle at the top of the lane, yes, which for me fits in with what you believe to be the truth of that morning.
Yeah, we had. I mean, there were very few tracking cars. We had one at Brentwood that was on permanent deployment to us at the Regional Crime Squad, and the TSU had another vehicle. And from memory, I think our vehicle was a white Sierra, or we had a white Sierra at Brentwood.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just jump back there when you're talking about the trackers? So, if a tracker isn't hardwired in, so it works on ignition, is it run on batteries? So it'd have to be constantly, every day or two, updated or rechanged over.
Yeah, it's literally, it was back then. Obviously, nowadays they're that size. Back then it was a brick, literally magnets and a brick, and most of that was battery. Obviously, battery technology wasn't as good as it is nowadays, but most of that was battery, and it was an old RF. It was just sending out a constant pulse, and your tracking car picked that pulse up, and then you guided yourself into it. It was very old. Well, then it was obviously cutting edge technology, but compared to what you can do now, it's very, very different.
Just I was thinking as well, how did the weather perform on them? Like at that time of year when that was snow, surely the weather would have drained that battery as well, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And, you don't know what other technical capability there would have been as well. There is the possibility that they put a probe in the car. I'm surmising this. This is not, I'm guessing. I think that probably it had a tracker on it, but it potentially could have had a probe in it. However, we have spoken to members of the TSU, Technical Support Unit for Essex Police back then, and they state categorically that they hadn't put a probe into the car, and they don't recall the tracker, or deploying a tracker. However, I would go on and say again, back then it was a little bit Wild Westish, and particularly Essex Drugs would put trackers onto cars even when there weren't or wasn't an authority. So it's entirely possible that is what happened.
Okay, moving on to the next question from Danny Stewart. Do you believe that Mick will be released, and why has it taken the parole board so long to decide?
This is a difficult one. As you're probably aware, his parole hearing was only a couple of days ago, and it's been adjourned, and I think that's about all we can say, Albert, isn't it?
David, it's been adjourned. Date to be decided, full stop. Sadly, that is all we can say, full stop.
Yeah.
Annoyingly. So
personally, he's an 81-year-old man. We've spoken to him on a number of occasions. He doesn't, in my opinion, and I'm sure Albert's opinion, as former police officers, I don't think he poses any risk to the public at all. And if you go down the line that, as we believe that he didn't actually carry out these murders, then obviously he definitely doesn't pose any risk to the public. Personally, I think he's being kept locked up to keep his mouth shut. That's I've said that from day one. There's nothing unusual in what I'm saying now. That's what I believe from day one.
Okay, next question is from Graham Wild. It's quite a long one, this. Will Nippa Ellis ever go to prison for anything or any length of time in his part in the Essex Boys murders? Him and his dad admit to their part in the murders, and Nippa is roaming free for his part, while his dad can't be held accountable because he's no longer here. Nippa was under police protection but running around with shotguns in his own admittance, but seems to have served no time for this. His dad was also in a crime gang in his own right, and Nippa followed the family tradition but ran to the police when Pat was said to cut his little sister's fingers off.
Do you want me to answer, Albert?
By the way, David.
Yeah, I mean, we've interviewed Nippa numerous times, and obviously we met him as well as part of the Sky documentaries and interviewed him. we have no reason to believe that Nippa's dad did or was involved in this at all. We discounted it after many interviews, and Nippa told us some stuff that wasn't true, and that sort of undermined his credibility almost from the first interview. We've spoken to other members of his family, and to a certain extent, Nippa genuinely believes what he's saying. He genuinely believes it. He gets very emotional when he says it. Whether his dad told him that, possibly his dad did tell him that, but there is no evidence that his father was involved at all. He had all the motive in the world to do it, but I don't think he was involved. He had an alibi, and the reality is, we don't think he had any. We're not going to discount it completely. We never will. But from what we've seen and what we've investigated so far, we don't think he had any involvement at all. And the other thing is, Nippa did go to prison. He wasn't being protected by Essex Police. That's absolute rubbish. He did shoot Pat, and he did go to prison for it.
Okay, moving on to the next question from Dean Slater. Who do you think shot them?
We tend to believe, we're not going to discount anything. However, we tend to believe that the Billy Jasper account is highly likely close to the truth. Not saying it's entirely true, but when you go through every bit of what he's saying, it makes sense. We've gone over and over and over. In 4 years, we have tried to pull it to pieces, and everything stacks up. And the very important thing, I think I mentioned it before, is he doesn't just talk about the murders of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. He talks about the murder of Nick Whiting, and the information that the evidence that he gives in relation to the murder of Nick Whiting is completely corroborated. We've spoken completely separately to Billy Jasper. We've spoken to the officer in the case for Nick Whiting's murder. We've spoken to surveillance officers from the Met who were on, watched or doing surveillance on the British flag at the time that one of the stolen cars turned up, etc., etc., etc. We've spoken to another Met detective who's, Albert Redding was his informant. That's in the public domain. No, there's nothing in Albert's dead, so it doesn't matter. But when you put everything together, what Billy Jasper is saying makes complete sense. Not everything is correct, but it makes a very compelling argument. Then you add into it and I've got to be very careful what I say here, when you add into it the new evidence, the new witnesses, it becomes even more compelling. I know one particular individual doesn't like the word compelling, but that's the word. It's compelling. And if you stuck it in front of the Court of Appeal and you got particularly the new witness to give evidence, I think that there'd be a finding of a miscarriage of justice almost immediately, a wrongful conviction immediately. So I think that to answer the question, the story that Billy Jasper puts forward, that he was the driver, he names the people who set it up, and I'm not going to name them here. He talks about Billy Gale, and that's been corroborated now. And he talks about the person who was the assassin, and that's the true. We think is probably the true story.
I'll just add to that, David. This is all about, for me, what Essex Police did not do as a result of the account that Billy Jasper gave initially to officers at Forest Gate and to officers on the murder investigation. It's called due diligence, i.e. you cannot get away with writing off the Jasper account as the detective superintendent in charge, Ivan Digger, did on his decision log, that it didn't fit with the current evidence, etc., etc. He can't even remember it, and he won't talk to us about it. Yeah, but if we just sat down with him and said, look, this is what decision you made, and look at what's in your Holmes account and on document 196 and what other people were saying about who was responsible, then it fits a damn sight more than Nichols' account, which was a total lie, And the only corroboration was from two witnesses, that one in particular we've disproved is probably just as big a liar as Darren Nichols himself. So Essex Police, sorry, but you didn't do a very good job, and it's never been independently reviewed by anybody since the murders took place, other than me and David over the last 4 years.
And you've got to remember, Lee, that, you know, the Jasper account wasn't really known about or in the public domain until we started scratching away, you know, what was it, 3-4 years ago. It was known about. And again, we go back to that noisy person who put it into his book in the very early days, and then covered the whole thing up, you know. But it has been there, but it's not been, no one's ever got a grip of it, and no one's ever looked behind it. And the advantage that we've had is that we know all of those characters, all those people that Billy Jasper's talking about. You know, I've spent years working on them, on the regional crime squad and other specialist crime squads. Albert separately, never worked with Albert in the police, but Albert separately, you know, on the flying squad. I mean, Albert, you know some of these people personally.
I used to train with one of them.
So, you know, these are people who are more than competent and capable of carrying out that assassination. You know, and as I keep saying, if Essex Police had just picked up the bloody phone and phoned anyone in the Metropolitan Police and said, hello, Essex Police here, murder squad, investigating Tate and Rolfe's murders. We've got a bloke in custody by the name of Billy Jasper. Number one, fireworks would have gone off because Billy Jasper was an informant, a high-profile, prolific, very trusted informant for the Met Police. Number two, the people he was talking about were all under investigation by some of the most senior teams in the Met. And one particular one, obviously Patsy Clark, was subject to the biggest ever investigation in the Met's policing history, the Brinks Mat robbery. So if you'd have just phoned the Met and mentioned those names, fireworks would have gone off. They would have had people coming down to see them. And importantly, you know, the handler for Billy would have come and given them material that would have shown that he was a trusted source, and would have probably been able to sit down and talk to Billy Jasper and probably got more from him at that stage. It was a complete and utter balls up from beginning to end by Essex Police, and simply we now think, and we can't work out why, but we now think the simple reason why they discounted his evidence was because he didn't take them to Workhouse Lane. When he took them out on two occasions, separate occasions, he didn't take them to the murder scene as they understood it. He took them, you know, to all intents and purposes, to a lane miles away. And they hadn't got the advantage of Google Maps and, you know, all the other advantages of modern day. They couldn't work out that what he was saying was a simple route across a field or a couple of fields to the murder scene and back. It was that close. They hadn't worked that out. And so they discounted it. And they discounted it quite wrongly.
Okay, moving on to the next question from Nick Shute. For clarification on a surveillance operation on TTR that was supposedly called off the day before the murders, was it still active on the day of the murders? And do you think it was possible that the bodies were discovered by the surveillance operatives before the landowners found the bodies?
I think we've
answered that already, did we?
The answer is yes. There's no evidence of that. Let me just add to that. There is no evidence of that. But my gut instinct is yes. Why would you call the surveillance off? They were their target. You know, they didn't call it off.
Okay, I've got quite a few questions here from Graham Wild. I'll start reading out one by one. One thing about the country